all sort of coming to a, they're theorizing anti-blackness as a structural position. So I don't want to like say it's happening elsewhere, because that is an important place where it's happening. But like if you're just looking for broader political examples, I think like the Million Hoodie March in response to Trayvon Martin, the I Am Trayvon Martin movement. But of course that's got like problematic issues in its own right, because our white people who say I am Trayvon Martin, right? Is that racial analogy, right? Do you have the same problems with the visibility of black skin as something that deputizes people? So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
I'm also thinking kind of loosely along kind of a few ideas that you brought up, that it's not that there aren't scholars that are speaking from their own population, but it's that in a lot of our classes and in a lot of our research, we're not using those scholars. We're using dead, old, white guys. And we're using them to examine marginalized populations. And that's, to me, inherently, as a researcher, problematic. If we're going to research a specific population, I think we have a little bit of an obligation to look for some scholars and some theorists that are doing work in that population and potentially are members or closely related. And I think that's a kind of institutional, academic problem, but as researchers, we can take a stance against that. We can use more female scholars. We can use more minority scholars that are doing the exact same research. And I think that's something that we can do actively. We don't have to cite the same people all the time. We can cite some different people and we'll still get papers accepted and published, right? So,
hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an active step that we can kind of take.
Great. We have a question in the back, Armand.
Alex?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just bump it up. I really like your paper, or at least from what I've heard of it, and we kind of talked. I'm a big fan to some extent of the Afro-pessimist. And I guess my question is kind of, how far do you take like the work of Wilderson? Right? Because if you take Wilderson seriously, right, you have to say that
give Turtle Island back to the savage. Yeah, give life back to the
black people are not human, right? So, then like I actually use that a lot, right? Like that concept, like the black, right? He talks about the black and it's part of this political ontology. So how, like, to what extent do you use that concept of inhumanity or fungibility, right? Like the kind of concepts that he used. And is there a point where you say, okay, he's gone a bit too far? Or, because I always feel like that when I read like Sexton and
yeah, it's a seductive essentialism in that regard, because it's the force of its theorizations is tempting, but the conclusions that it comes to can be problematic. And I really like, I think the way to sort of redress this is a line that Jared Sexton picks up in a 2011 article, that it is not that there is an absence of black social life, but it is rather that black social life, right, and this is, I think the danger that I'm pointing at here is that if we theorize black as inhuman, then we theorize black as a position without agency, as a position without power, as a non-subject that can't do anything. And I think this line that Sexton has, that black social life emerges out of a situation in which black social death is the constant state of police force. What you see is the vibrancy of black culture and black cultural discourse that emerges out of real historical situations of white supremacy. But I think this concept of the human that you're getting at also resonates with a bunch of the work that I've done, bringing in, Giorgio Agamben was like the person who brought me into critical theory. And I think the importance of Agamben scholarship, and this is something that Sexton picks up in People of Color Blindness, is a theorization of the limits of the ethical intelligibility of the human. Right, that we like to think of the human as the foundation of our ethics, right? And this is, even from the history of all, the black rhetorical humanist struggles, that ain't I a human too, ain't I a woman too, I am a man too, right? I am a person too. But that those, sort of foundations have an ethical limit that we need to bear witness to, we need to bear witness to that inhuman remainder of human life.
Yeah, so this is the order I've got right now. Of course, it's always movable. Pat, Kashif, and then Dr.
just want to follow up on this idea of blackness as ontology, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with Eduardo Silva? Bonilla Silva, yeah, thank you. You're familiar, so he writes about this notion of color blindness and makes the claim that, you know, following along with what you're saying, race as power, right? That they're basically, we can think about racial hierarchies as only having 3 levels. White, honorary white, and black. And so then this, you know, we start to kind of get to some of these questions about, you know, slipping among these kinds of constructions of race, and it takes us into questions about immigration, and specifically your question about the Trayvon Martin protests and the question of kind of white body, you know, so that way it takes it out of the body to a certain extent, right? Thinking just in terms of sort of the powerness, but the power construction, but also going back to connecting it to a particular history that centers white supremacy as the foundational ideology. So there's a question in there, just take one in.
So I like this dichotomy between, or the trichotomy.
The levels, hierarchy.
Yeah,
if race is about power and, you know,
the white, the honorary white, and the black, and I think that, the question, what's the question you're getting at here?
Yeah. Threw that back to you to get the question.
One of the things that I think is interesting, and this is something that Jared Sexton's amalgamation schemes, multiracialism, and the critique of anti-blackness is all about, is this theory of answering the critique of the black-white binary, right? That as multiracial theory developed 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, to the diversifying scene of American democracy, it leveled a critique of the black-white binary, right? And what Jared Sexton talks about, he places that critique in a historical context of how it was picked up by political actors, and specifically in the context of the census movement, to get a multiracial category on the census movement, and theorize the black-white binary as you know, sort of that means to centering black power movements. And so I think and this is which is why I love Sexton's term, people of color blindness, right? That it's not just a matter of color blindness, but that when we theorize generically people of color, what we're missing is the historical specificity of black struggles and black power movements, and how those black power movements were the ones that, and I think this is something Dr. Cloud talked about yesterday, that there was a strong force of the black power movement that created that radical wing that made the demands of the civil rights movement truly antagonistic. And what I worry in, generically in the critique of the black-white binary is that we have lost, it's used as a way to censure the black power movements that created that third wing.
And so what I was hearing and what I was trying to present and thinking about Bonilla Silva's work is the fluidity and something that you said about sort of the tenacity of white supremacist power, of reproducing itself. To me, I see his work as sort of an example of that. And so that's what
definitely you have to
so maybe I didn't have a question, I just wanted to bring that up.
Eduardo Bonilla Silva?
Bonilla Silva.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to interrupt the pattern I just laid out, and I feel like we've put Alex on the spot for a few minutes. I have another question for Marlo. Does anyone else have a question for one of the other 2 participants? Yeah, go ahead.
This may be more so targeted to Stevie, though I think all 3 of you could speak to this. When you're looking at communication and representation, you talk about how we have the potential for it to be kind of liberatory. I'm wondering how contingent you think that is on the shift of doing language of communication as constitutive to performative. And so, how necessary do you think that liberation is on the idea that language does something as opposed to just naming something?
Yep,
It's not gonna eat it.
I think it's very important. I think this kind of links up with an idea of, is our research just research, or or is it actually doing something? And I think that, I think those ideas are linked up. Are we just narrating about a problem and presenting a problem? Or are we suggesting potential solutions? Are we suggesting potential change, transformative change? So I think it's an important question, especially linked up with the idea of performance. Is it just a presentation and sort of a rhetoric or a dialogue? Or are we really highlighting the performance of language and the embodiment of language as more than just sort of signs and symbols and signifiers? I think it's a very important question. And my paper, that kind of goes beyond my paper, but I think that that's something as scholars we should all consider, especially in the presentation of populations, any population we're representing. How are we presenting them, right? Are we just giving them some signs, signifiers, and symbols to work with, or are we truly embodying their performance? Yeah, it's an important question.
My question is sort of similar, but it's specifically for Marlo. Sorry about that.
You knew it'd be you
I
at
did.
some point.
But I was wondering if the diversity statements that you're looking at, you're literally only looking at the discourse and the language, or are you looking at the way that it's enforced and practiced at these institutions? If they're really following what their statement says, or if you've seen any correlation with that.
So what I talked about today was really just some exploratory research for my dissertation project. But I see my dissertation project taking sort of a critical discourse analysis approach in which you would look at the deeper context within which this rhetoric. So first I would look at it from like a rhetorical perspective, from a critical but then, look at, so I would look, for example, and I haven't, my sample selection and all that is still percolating and I have some ideas, but for example, I was thinking perhaps of looking at schools that have racial incidents, such as Oberlin College recently, which, prides itself on being like this liberal bastion of liberalness, and looking at both the dominant narratives about how, no, this doesn't happen here, as well as like counter narratives, which I found about people in the community, black people in the community and their views on Oberlin. So another text I might look at would be like campus climate reports. So some schools have those published and accessible. So kind of the accessibility of those information, of that type of information would influence probably my sampling, convenient sampling, I think. So yes, I think that's the short answer, right?
So I'm going to hit up my previous thing. Kashif, are you done now?
No, I mean, my question is for Alex, if that's okay.
I think we're ready.
I
got water, so we're ready.
Again, thanks. I'm curious as to whether you consider the flip side of Afro-pessimism, Afro-optimism, particularly articulated through folks like Fred Moten, in particular strands and Celia Hartman, that offer a different interpretation of black ontology that does emerge from this state of slavery, but opens up blackness to consider things much more, opens up blackness to consider it beyond visibility, to consider the oral performative potentiality contained within blackness, and escapes this kind of very pessimistic ontological state.
I think this is something I touch on only briefly in my paper. It's in the parts where I talk about right. And you know what? This was a thesis chapter that was already like 60 pages long. And for a while, when I was at about page 35, I was like, oh shit, I've got to write about right. I can't do this paper and just write about Obama. I've got to write about the generative, affective, positive discourse of black vernacular and black cultural voice, right? The beyond visibility into the voice, right? The speech acts of, how is it that black life, black social life, and black optimism emerges out of these spaces of anger. And I think that's something that I sort of anchor in my paper with this conversation about Sexton, and Sexton's got a great line in Amalgamation Schemes about how we need to not just think of black anger as a negative force, but as a positive source of political potentiality. I have not really engaged that much with Moten does the case of blackness, right? haven't studied it as much as I need to, and hopefully at UNC here we can work with Duke folks. That's right, at our peril.
It
right, we
is,
can
no,
work with
it
Duke
is
folks,
highly
and,
encouraged to take advantage of their
Fred
resources.
Moten is a weird dude.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, that was one of my hopes was, maybe help me study some of that stuff. I think insofar as my paper deals with it, it deals with it as right and how this, rights discourse contains an excluded kernel of code that, we need to latch onto that as not the opposite of politics, but as the generative source of where a politics that is truly capable of addressing anti-black violence comes from.
Did you talk about liberation theology? Let me just, I'm sorry, I'm breaking a rule, but just in that chapter, do you talk about
I
liberation
don't know.
theology?
That was like one of those oh my God, I haven't studied any of this. I need to study right. I need to study liberation theology. I need to study the entirety of the Trinity Church. And,
It's too much.
So, Dr. Cox?
Yeah, take a study break and have a deep breath.
Yes.
And then I just want to say that I found your paper very exciting, both in terms of its content and delivery. And I'm right with you. I mean, I'm of the belief, and this kind of relates to other papers as well, but the reason that we talk in binaries sometimes is that the binaries are real. And we can't talk them out of existence. And racial oppression, class polarization, these things are indeed, in fact, binary. So there's that. So I'm totally with you about the specificity against the analogy, about the aphasia, and then I just didn't agree with you about Marxism and Gramsci. And so, but because basically I think
that was where this was going.
I think they're getting kind of a bad rap in these other authors because I don't think that they are fully, because this ontological status does come with being commodified as an object for sale. And so that it was basically the existence of slavery in a democratic context that necessitated the ontological invention of a subhuman blackness. And I mean, Martin Solers makes this point, Roediger makes this point, Kolek-Yumin makes this point. I mean, that historically, I mean, there's not really, I don't know how you can counter that evidence that the political economy of primitive accumulation and the invention of blackness are closely related, and that it's not just about skin, but that it's about a particular social relation. And that, I'm not saying not to reduce it at all, because I think that social condition exists, and I'm no argument other than that right now.
So can I tag on to your question and open it up to the rest of our members as well? Because this dichotomy that you just pulled out, Dr. Cobb, real, right? What is real? And I feel like we're kind of addressing that in all of these papers, the real, the material, versus the discourse, right? The discourse of diversity, the representation of scholars. And I'm curious to hear anyone who wants to respond specifically, Alex, since that question was originally directed towards you. How do you negotiate that tension in your work? It's one of our hardest moves as communication scholars, right? The tension between the real, the material, the constructed, the discursive, and what we study, race specifically.
Well, I'm a discoursist, I guess. So, I mean, I focus my scholarship, my work, particularly on how dominant discourses constrain people and form people's identity. So when I look at diversity discourses, I'm looking at how people are othered within organizations. I've also done work on like Asperger's and what I call the tyranny of neuronormativity. I also look at polyamory and different forms of marriage. So, and what I've seen, I spend a lot of time on discussion boards where people generate new ways to embody their identity, their relationship, their thing. So like this discourse is so helpful to people negotiating their lived embodied identities. So I always go back to discourse, understanding the material consequence. I don't see them as separate at all.
Thank you.
I think for me, a lot of it, to answer your question first, sort of is all in the interplay between materiality and materialism. And this idea, you know, and I think both, this is one of those where it's always the both and, right? It's always the both and. And insofar as ideologies have, you know, it plays, it also, so between materialism and materiality and ideology and affect, right? That ideology carries certain affective structures that hide the material or that block out an analysis of the real material, but also that rhetoric contains materiality, or rhetoric generates materiality, the affective force of Afro-pessimism, stuff like that. You know, how does the materiality of Obama's biracial body navigate, you know, real tensions that Americans feel, or that are generated in their body, and the biology of the white skin that I can't escape, right? How does it navigate those things? I don't think I have an answer per se, but that's sort of my two conceptual frameworks there.
My research sort of with intolerance is actually originally rooted in intolerance in Europe. And so I specifically examined intolerance directed towards Turkish populations living in Germany, because they make up the largest minority population living in Germany and suffer a significant amount of othering, both at the institutional level, the social level, the economic level, and in many ways has been further problematized with the EU and the assignment of you know, visas based on status and citizenship. And so for me, in examining that specific population, it became incredibly important to recognize that there is a binary. There are Germans and there are non-Germans. But in the presentation of engaging that kind of intolerance and presenting that population, I found it to be incredibly important to understand and represent that population as more than just being immigrants from Turkey, but being people from Turkey who speak German, who are in some ways nationalized citizens, who are full workers, who hold part-time visas, who go back and forth between Turkey and Germany. And I think with doing that, you start to see a population that's extremely complex, and that the intolerance directed towards this population is not just based on country of origin. It's based on a lot of different factors, not excluding you know, a lot of historical issues that Germany has faced and that Europe has faced. And so for me, it really goes, I think, to this idea that I see categories not operating in isolation or in sort of these clean boxes, but that they spill over into other issues. And I think as a researcher, I find that to be sort of part of my responsibility, you know, to really present those populations that way. But also, you know, to not deny that there are these binary or even trinary problems that do not represent a population in the way that they should be. So that's, for me, kind of how I think I engage that.
Wonderful. Well, we are at our official time limit, so thank you again.